James, thanks for having me again. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, and I appreciate you sharing your platform with me. It's interesting to me, as you said, I don't want the audience to get the impression that I'm very anachronistic. I'm not somebody who's trying to take us backward in time, but I do think that the elephant is healthier in the wild than in the zoo. And since the elephant's a mammal, just like us, it stands to reason that we're healthier in the wild than in the zoo. That doesn't mean the animal in the zoo doesn't live longer, because it often does. But if you ask the lion, would you like a slightly shorter life in the wild or a longer life in captivity? Which would you want? Would you like to live 120 years in a prison cell or 100 years out on the wild landscape where you have fulfillment? So, this is an important thing to work through. And that idea of captivity is interesting because much of the captivity that we've lived in has been invisible for a long time. But we are in a stage right now where some of it's becoming manifest in the exterior world. And the interesting thing when you look at human beings now, when I talk about indigenous peoples, I'm not bringing up the identity politics side of that, but more saying I'm looking at what human beings are like outside of this, what we call civilization, the people who build city states and who live on domesticated landscapes and built environments. And when we look at those people, one of the most fascinating, and the reason is, just like it would be smart for the person who maintains the chimpanzees in the zoo to understand how chimps are in the wild, it would be smart for humans to look at how we are in the wild to get a sense of what our needs are. One of the really interesting things about human beings in
Mm.
the wild is that they don't have the same hierarchical structure that we have. The so-called chief can't tell the people what to do. He can suggest, but if he starts telling people what to do, guess what? No longer the chief. And that's because every individual is considered a sovereign, even when they're quite young. And we have gotten very far away from that. And what we're living under now is a lot more like a intensive factory farming operation for human beings, where the people are like the cattle inside.
Yeah, and I think something that's really interesting is just last week I was visiting. I'm currently in Vanuatu, which is this small island between Fiji and Australia. And last week we visited this remote island called Epi Island, and it was originally visited by colonists, in the late 1800s, and they planted a lot of copra and or coconut and cacao for export. But there's these many parts of the island that are untouched and they're indigenous and they're cut off by supply chains. They're not really able to visit, and it's rare for a white person to go there. I mean, even walking into the village, we would have groups of 20 or 30 children staring at you. You're the first white person they've seen. And we stayed in a village up in the hills with a friend of ours from the sort of town area here. And I say town, but this is a very remote indigenous part of the world. Port Vila is the main town of the capital here. And we go to this remote village, and the way they live, Daniel, the way that they're integrated in the environment, they have a chief structure. They have a paramount chief, and they have other chiefs in the village, and they have a chief's nakamal when they meet and they make decisions about the people. But like you said, everyone is a sovereign individual. Everyone has their own land. Everyone has their own space. Everyone is free to plant, to gather, to hunt, to trade. Money doesn't really exist in this culture, and they have developed this incredible way of understanding when to plant taro or manioc or kava or yam or kumala, which they call sweet potato, crop spacing, the time to harvest it, when everything is ready. They've just got this incredibly intricate connection with their food, and that results in a body and a structure and a health and a vibrancy that you're not used to seeing in the West. Maybe with extreme athletes, you'd see this type of health, this type of body, this type of constitution, this energy. And this is like everybody in this village, right? Nobody's obese. Nobody is frail and weak and humbling. Nobody is like walking around. They're just powerful, strong people, and they know how to use a knife, Daniel. They know how to dig a hole in the ground. They know how to harvest food from the environment, and they're very skilled at it, and it puts you to shame in a big way. And it starts to highlight this divide you talk about: captivity and wild living people. And if we want to understand how to be healthy, and I love this about you, you're like, let's study wild indigenous people. So tell me, what do they do differently to us today? Some of the big key things that they do differently that you think has made us so fragile, weak, and sick for that matter. I mean, cancer, heart disease, autoimmune conditions, etc., skyrocketing. And I speak to these guys, oh, do you have any diabetes? Oh, no, that's only in the city. And they call it sick blow sugar, sick belonging to sugar. They call it as it is. They know that if you're an indigenous person, you go to the city and you eat sugar, you become sick of sugar. And that's the name of diabetes in this custom. So they see it and it's so powerful and I love it. And this is what your work's about. And I feel like I was living your work last week. Tell me, what are the big things that indigenous people do that really set them apart from us and how we can sort of reappropriate our way back there? We'll get to that towards the end.
Sure. Let me just give a little background. I got into food from a nutritional perspective. That was all my always my interest, but as I went deeper down the food journey, it's been a couple decades now. But when I was a young man, my interest was just following what's the healthiest diet. And I always felt there must be food for humans. We must have a natural diet because, when I study any other animal, I quickly find out just looking at an encyclopedia page, looking at a Wikipedia, looking at any kind of field guide, this is the diet of that animal. So it'd be like, well, what about people? We're mammals, we're primates. Don't we have a diet? It's really confusing. And over the years, it led me to developing a hunting and gathering practice that's kind of now where my focus is. What I learned there, incidentally, was a lot more than what I was looking for. And it relates back to this connection, which we can go into more deeply in a minute. But another thing that I've learned along the way is that we're all very fit for our environment. This is an important concept when we talk about fitness, which is your ability to survive and reproduce in your environment. The thing with most indigenous people who are still living their traditional life way, because of course we have lots of indigenous peoples who are now living in urban and built environments, but when they're living their traditional life way, they are extremely unfit and extremely out of shape for the built environment. If you bring them into it, they are quickly damaged by it, particularly the kinds of calories we're able to concentrate in the category of fat, sugar, and alcohol. Their bodies don't have the ability to process those extremely dense calorie sources that we've grown so accustomed to. They also can't tolerate within one generation our sedentism because they're active moving people. Now, keep in mind, if that's true, if they are adapted, highly fit for the outdoor environment, for the wilderness, wherever they are found in the world, we could look at ourselves and say, wait a second, we actually are extremely fit for the built environment. We're extremely fit for our sedentism. We have over generations been adapting ourselves to this slovenly lifestyle.